Welcome back, everybody. Glad that you're here today. We have a pretty good group of folks who've been able to join us. I just want to let everybody know what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be going over the answers to the exercise. Hopefully you had an opportunity to work on that. So we'll go over those answers, and then we'll answer any questions that you have about the exercise, in addition to anything that you learned yesterday that you're still not clear about. So you'll want to go ahead and type those in the Q&A box, and we'll answer those. And then we will, once we get through all those questions, Les has a list of the questions that came in yesterday, and so that's really helpful. He'll go over some of the answers of those, and then if there's any areas that people still seemed a little confused about, we'll maybe explore a couple of the concepts and go over those as well. So hopefully that will work for you today. I'm going to be pulling up the exercise, and the way this works when we're not showing the slides, if depending on your screen size, when I scroll down, your screen is not going to scroll down. So you're going to need to hover your cursor to the right side of the exercise, and you should see a gray bar. And then you can just use your mouse or your mouse pad and scroll down to the rest of the page in order for you to see the other questions. So if you are looking at the screen and you're like, oh, I can't see, you know, the question 4 and 5, find that cursor and scroll down. So let's get started, and I'm going to be going back and forth between the exercise and the slides, because I think it's really helpful to know where did this information come from in case you need to go back later and try to apply it again. So the first question that we have is, how do HUD lead-based paint regulations work in tandem with the CDC and with EPA? And so the CDC stands for the Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention Program. So let's go to our slides, and I'm going to go to slide 23. And so here you can see we have this reference here about the CDC and the reference value right now. So right now, the reference values are different. The CDC recently lowered their reference value to 3.5 micrograms per deciliter. HUD has maintained theirs at 5 micrograms per deciliter at this time, but there could be a time in the future where they do align again. But they are, HUD does monitor what the CDC is doing, and wants to make sure that they are reacting as appropriately. So right now the numbers do not match, but they could again in the future. And then we have EPA, and so we talked yesterday about how the lead rules you know, overlap and work in tandem with the EPA requirements. And so remember, we had the disclosure rule. So the disclosure rule matches the EPA disclosure rule. And then we had the lead-based paint activities rule. And then we have the subparts E and Q, the RRP rule, the renovation, repair, and painting rule. So we went over RRP quite a bit, talking about the different safe practices that need to be followed now by renovators or doing any type of repair and painting if the area is larger than the HUD de minimis. So Les went over that quite a bit yesterday. All right, let's go back to our exercise, and we'll look at question 2. What projects or units must comply with the lead safe housing rule, and what are they subject to? So what are the enforcements regarding that? So we'll go back. Remember, we're dealing with pre-1978 units. So all pre-1978 units that do not have an exception fall under the lead safe housing rule. And I'm going to go to slide 29. So we're trying to figure out who's responsible. So remember, it's our owners and our property managers, as well as the grantee, who could also be the Public Housing Authority for Subpart M, tenant-based rental assistance. And so we have our owners and our property managers and their maintenance employees. They're subject to following the federal requirements, as well as we have our program operators and our program staff. We also had another slide here that talked about some of our key actors. We have, in addition to our program staff, there may be times where we need to hire lead specialists. And for paint stabilization, we would need to hire RRP workers. So we'd want to make sure that they are trained through the EPA training and that they have that proper certification and credentials to show the owner who's hiring them to do that work. And then also clearance needs to be achieved. And so the owner would need to hire either a risk assessor or a lead-based paint inspector or a clearance examiner to be able to achieve that clearance. All right, let's look at question number 3. What are the types of vendors or contractors and their qualifications that a manager or owner should have available to them or on call? So for this one, I want to look at our worker handout. Here we go. So remember, we need to be looking, and to look, we need to have a visual assessor do that type of looking to see if there's any deteriorated paint. And the visual assessor is someone who's trained using that HUD-free online visual assessment training. And so it could be the owner when they're doing ongoing maintenance requirements of doing the reinspection. The grantee is going to want to be doing that initial visual assessment to make sure the unit is clear of any deteriorated paint and hazards. So we want to have a visual assessor available. And then if there's any work that needs to be done, if deteriorated paint was identified, then we would need to have somebody do the paint stabilization. That would be an RRP certified contractor firm or renovators, the workers. And then, like I mentioned, we would need to have clearance done. And so clearance needs to be done by a risk assessor or a lead-based paint inspector or a clearance technician. And then we have our ongoing maintenance. And so the ongoing maintenance, again, is then done by the owner. And like I said, if any work needs to be done by RRP certified workers. Okay, so let's look at question number 4. List the key steps and documents that the owner or the program operators must implement to assure the units that they assist are in compliance. So I want to go to our slides, and I want to look at our summary handout. So this is something that I work quite a bit from home now since COVID happened, but when I had an office, I used to have these summary sheets on my bulletin board next to my desk, because then it was easy for me to, I'm old school, I like paper, so I was able to look and see, oh yes, that's the next step, or that's the requirement for Subpart M, or that's the requirement for Subpart J, whichever activity I was working with. So use these summary charts to help you. It's difficult to remember everything, and you should use these resources to have available to you. But this is a good step-by-step that walks through what the requirements are. So first we have disclosure, and so disclosure, remember, everybody that goes through TBRA, all of those households, regardless of whether there's a child under 6 residing in the unit or not, will receive disclosure for pre-78 units. So they'll get a signed and dated disclosure form by the property owner. A copy of that should be given to the program. The owner should also be providing that Protect Your Family from Lead pamphlet. There should be an acknowledgement that that was received, and as the grantee, I'd want a copy of that acknowledgement. And then there should be tenant instructions, because remember, we need our tenants to tell the owner if they see any new deteriorated paint, or if there's water damage and it's starting to deteriorate the paint. So they need to be able to know what to do and who to contact if they see any type of new deterioration. Then we have our looking, and that's our visual assessment. So we're doing the visual assessment, someone who's trained as a visual assessor. If this is our initial occupancy, that would be our grantee who's doing that visual assessment to ensure that it's meeting all of the requirements so that there's no deteriorated paint. And again, remember, after disclosure, everything down here is only required for tenant-based rental assistance if there's a child under the age of 6 residing in the unit. So if we did that review, we did that visual assessment, and we did find deteriorated paint, the landlord does need to treat that. And so they are going to be doing paint stabilization. They need to hire someone who's trained in RRP. So we'd want to have the certifications that people have for their training. They should have some documentation to show that they've been trained in RRP. The RRP pamphlet and that acknowledgement form also needs to be collected. If there's any type of relocation that's needed, there should be occupant protection. We want to have documentation of that. And then after the work's done, the unit needs to be cleared, so it needs to pass our clearance test. And that's done by a risk assessor or a lead-based paint inspector or a clearance technician. So we would have, again, documentation of the people who conducted the clearance as well as a copy of the clearance report. And then there's that notification, that telling. So we would have a copy of the lead hazard reduction notice. We would make sure that was provided within 15 days of receiving the clearance report. And since there was work done in that unit as it related to lead, we now need to have some type of report that's connected to the disclosure notice. So we now know that this was treated and what that document is, as well as if this was a lease renewal, it would be an updated disclosure notice. And then we move into ongoing maintenance, where we're asking our tenants to report any new hazards they see. We also need to have a copy of that report that somebody did a visual assessment and they either did or did not find any new deteriorated paint. If they did not, they can just sign it and stick it in the file. If they did, then we go through all the steps again. We need to hire someone trained in RRP. We need to have clearance. We need to provide that notification. So we need to update the disclosure notice. So all those things need to be followed again. But go back to the summary sheet because this really helps you be grounded in a real quick way of trying to figure out what do you need to do and who needs to do it. All right, let's go back to our exercise. We have our last question before we get into our scenario. How do you know if your organization is ready to meet compliance? Well, attending this training is a good start. So now you're starting to understand what the requirements are for Subpart M. You should have policies and procedures in place. When I work on policies and procedures, I always like to see the forms that are being used as well as the roles, who's responsible for what, what's the timing, when do things need to happen. You want to make sure you're using the proper forms. We showed you the wrong disclosure form. We showed you the correct disclosure form. Make sure your program is communicating with your owners on what the right form should be. And also communicating with the owners and landlords what the requirements are, what the expectations of them are as well. All right, let's look at our scenario. So we have a scenario where a family is using a housing choice voucher certificate, and they are renting a unit in the Tucker Commons, which was built in 1950. And the family has 2 children. One is age 4 and one is 9. And this is the first family using HUD assistance in a while, and the landlord can't remember if there's lead in the unit or not. They're not sure what to do. So what is the public housing agency, or if it's a home program running a tenant-based rental assistance program, what do they need to make sure the landlord is doing in order for this unit to be lead safe or to be lead safe? So first off, we need to figure out, does the lead safe housing rule apply? was this unit built before 1978? Well, the answer to that is yes. We know that the unit was built in 1950, so the lead-safe housing rule does apply. So we want to make sure that our landlord is providing the disclosure notice. And so they're going to give the disclosure notice, and they're going to keep the original in the file. There's going to be a copy provided to the tenant. There's going to be a copy provided to the program. And then we also want to make sure that this pamphlet is being handed out so that they're aware of how to protect their family from lead in their home. And we want to have a copy of an acknowledgement that they actually received that pamphlet. So we'd like to have a copy of that as well. We now know that there's a child under the age of 6 that's residing in the unit, and so we have to continue on with the other requirements. Remember, we had our chart here, so we need to now do these other requirements. So we need to do a visual assessment. So we're doing a visual assessment, we're doing it at move-in, we're doing it, the landlord is doing it at every 12 months to ensure that it's still meeting all the standards of that area. And so during that visual assessment, they identify deteriorated paint. So that, this family has not moved in yet. They want to move in, but we're checking and we see that there's deteriorated paint. And so we need to make sure that deteriorated paint is addressed properly. And so we told the landlord what the issue was. The landlord has hired an RRP certified renovator who's going to be doing paint stabilization. And so they are going to be removing loose paint and other materials from that surface to be treated. They're going to repair any defects in the substrate. They're going to apply a new protective coat or paint. And this is being completed by an RRP certified contractor. And so we're checking to make sure that they meet the qualifications. They are going to be handing out this Renovate Right pamphlet to the owner. If this was an occupied unit, then the tenant would also be receiving that Renovate Right pamphlet as well. And then we're going to be, after the work is done, the unit needs to pass clearance. And so Les talked about this yesterday, how the unit needs to be passed clearance, and that's done by a certified risk assessor or lead-based paint inspector or a clearance examiner. So we would have copies of the clearance report. We would have copies of the notice of lead hazard reduction activities that was done as well. So all those documents need to be maintained, and then after that's done and we know it passes clearance, then we're going to send our inspector out again to do another visual assessment. And if it passes this time, we don't see any deteriorated paint, then the family is able to move in. But before the family signs that lease, they are going to get a copy of a disclosure notice that provides information about this lead hazard reduction work that was just done. Any copies of reports are going to be part of that. And then during the year, the responsibility of the owner is to continue ongoing maintenance. So they're going to be doing a visual assessment every 12 months as long as that household is residing in that unit. They're going to respond to and clear any new deteriorated paint. They are also providing a written notice asking the residents to identify any new or deteriorated paint. Okay, and we're making sure everybody is keeping track of all of our records, and we're maintaining our records for the period of time that the program requires. All right, and also, there was another follow-up question here. Not sure if it was on your exercise or not, but what if the kids were 8 and 10? What if we didn't have a child under 6 that was not going to reside in the unit? Well, if our children are older, if they're 8 and 10, then the lead-safe housing rule does not apply for tenant-based rental assistance. Remember, for Subpart M, tenant-based rental assistance, the lead-safe housing rule only applies if there's a child under 6 residing in the unit. So we would still require the landlord to do disclosure, because disclosure is required for all pre-78 units, regardless of occupancy. So they would need to do a lead disclosure, and then if there was any work that was identified that needed to be done, the EPA RRP requirements are still required. And let me see if I can get to that slide. This is what happens when I talk off script. It's hard for me to find the right slide number. Yep, there we go. Okay. So remember, the RRP rule does apply for all units here that are pre-78. So they would still need to hire someone who's trained in RRP, and they would need to follow the RRP rules. But we don't need to follow the lead-safe housing rules if there's not a child under 6 living in our tenant-based rental assistance unit. So, Les, that was a lot of information, and I've been talking for a really long time. Is there questions that have come up or anything you'd like to share or expand on?
I just wanted to add to this that I think this is a great example of kind of thinking through, okay, to be prepared for operating a program that these sorts of things are going to come up, what might we want to have in place? So, Chris talked about the fact that, the owner is going to be responsible for some portions of this, so thinking about, well, how on the front end do I make sure that owners understand their responsibilities, but also thinking about, how do I assist them in being able to identify if they need to hire an RRP certified contractor, how do they identify who's available in the area, the kind of documentation that would need to be in place. We've talked about needing to have a certified clearance technician. So those sorts of things that, in this example, we have a household that's waiting to move in. So we've got this process needs to be completed, including clearance, before that can happen. So, having, identified a process, helping that owner get somebody hired to be able to do that, but also to be ready to get that clearance handled will kind of help to be able to move forward with that project. So I think this is a good exercise in just thinking about, okay, am I ready? And are my owners ready on these types of projects, and how do I best communicate this, kind of incorporate it into my sort of normal policies and procedures on this is kind of an important, it should be sort of a takeaway, I think, on this on next steps. So let's look. We have no questions that have come in yet in the Q&A. So what I'm going to go ahead and do, and I will encourage folks, as you're kind of thinking about this, or if you have questions that you brought to today's session, if you'll go ahead and plug them in, open up the Q&A box and type your questions in. We'll address those, but in the meantime, I wanted to go over a few.
Do you want me to give you control, Les, or do you want me to move the slides?
Yeah, it would be good because I'm going to flip
the
different slides.
All right, I've just given you control.
All right, so I went back through yesterday's questions, and Chris has done a great job in walking you through the exercise that some of these things we've kind of revisited as part of going over that part. But there were questions about, record keeping, and when does the visual assessment not apply? When is it exempted? So we really have sort of two separate items here as I see it. First off, as Chris showed you on the Subpart M, we have, this is being applied other than the disclosure and the tenant instructions. The rest of this is being applied where we have households that include children under the age of 6. So that essentially gives you an exemption on some of these, most of these steps other than the disclosure and the tenant instructions. But also, I'm going to see where that slide is. So here we go. So also keep in mind we have exemptions on the lead safe housing rule overall. So if we have units that are constructed after January 1st, 1978, then we don't have to we don't have to deal with the lead safe housing rule. And then we also talked about if we had units that were specifically restricted for the elderly or the disabled community, we could have some properties that were already found, they've been tested, and they were found to be lead-free. So we could have, a pre-1978 unit that either it never had lead or it's all been removed, and so that would also, we'd be able to document that this property, this unit, is exempt from the lead safe housing rule and be able to be exempt from that. And then we had some discussion yesterday also about 0-bedroom units and SROs. So this is, I think, the most unrestrictive of the requirements for Subpart M, because under TBRA, we don't have a long-term relationship with these units. We're providing assistance to this household. And so during that time period, we're going to be keeping an eye on that. There was a question that came up yesterday about, okay, we talked about under this subpart that the level of, on here, the level of our assessment is going to be a visual assessment. And so we talked about the fact that this is an online training and certification, so it's free. It would be simple for staff or a property owner, maybe a property manager, maintenance staff, to take that training and become qualified to be able to complete that visual assessment for that. And there was a question about, well, how often do we have to do that? So there is not an expiration date on the visual assessment certification. Might make, as Bruce suggested yesterday, might make a good sense to, from time to time, go back through that just to refresh your knowledge and make sure that the person who is certified, is really staying current on the requirements, but there is not a expiration date on that. And then we had a couple of questions in the same vein when we were talking about the level of evaluation. Because our materials talk about a risk assessment, there were a lot of questions about, wait a minute, is it a visual assessment? Is it a risk assessment that's required? So for Subpart M, our visual assessment is going to be what's required, and Chris mentioned, when the visual assessment determines that there are surfaces that need to be treated, then we're going to do paint stabilization, do the clearance, and do a visual assessment then when that's completed to verify that this unit now is lead safe and can be occupied by that household. The time that we would have that a risk assessor, an assessment would be needed would be in the case where we have a child with an elevated blood lead level. So Chris did the fastest version of that, but recommended that folks, utilize the pre-recorded session, which is much longer, walking through the EBLL response when we have a child with an elevated lead level. But part of the requirement on that would be that there be an environmental investigation done. And so that environmental investigation includes a risk assessment plus some additional criteria looking at environmental factors on that, trying to determine what's the cause of this child having an elevated lead level. There also were a number of questions on trying to figure out, well, what rules actually apply. Go back to slides, and I want to pull up a slide here. So Chris walked us through the legislative housing rule regulations and the fact that we have some sections of this that apply across the board, such as the disclosure, general requirements, but then depending on the activity that you are undertaking, there would be specific subparts that would apply and would lay out the specific requirements. So, for instance, you'll see here in one of our upcoming webinars is on project-based assistance, but we also are talking today about tenant-based rental assistance. There's a separate subpart L for public housing programs. We talked about in some examples where you might simply be providing leasing assistance, and so you would fall under subpart K versus subpart M. And so it's really important to be able to first define for the activity that I'm undertaking, which of these subparts do I need to be following, and then know the details on that. Probably the one with the most details and the most stringent requirements are under subpart J, where you're running a rehabilitation program, doing a rehabilitation of some kind. So it's important to understand that. Let's see what else we have. Oh, there were some questions about, because we tried to point out a lot of resources for folks. So we had some questions about, hey, wait a minute, you're saying there's a toolkit. Where do I find that? Oh, that did not go. Let's try this. There we go. So I just wanted to revisit, and I think most of those questions came in before we got to the end of our session, but because this is going to be your sort of go-to spot following this training, I think it's worthwhile kind of just revisiting this. So we mentioned that there is a landing page on the HUD Exchange, and the link is at the bottom of this slide, which is where most all of our resources on this are going to be easily accessed. So we mentioned about the toolkit, which is accessed from that landing page, and we provided the direct link on this. And this is where, based on the type of action you were undertaking or the subpart that you were implementing, based on the type of activity you were undertaking, that those tools, those sample documents that we referenced throughout the training, things like we talked about, there was a log that could be used when you were conducting a visual assessment. All of that is available at this location, and I think it would be important to review those following this training, familiarize yourself with those resources and those samples, documents that could be adapted for your program. Also, we talked and referenced a number of times about some of these videos. And think about, not only it's a matter of you and your staff having adequate knowledge of the regulations that apply to the programs that you're operating, but as I'm mentioning, trying to make sure that owners understand what their tasks and requirements would be, what the standards are. And so this might also be a resource as you're thinking about how do I communicate some of that. You may be able to use some of the links that have been identified here to assist in communicating with those owners, either planning for actions they might need to take as they arise, or in response and helping them through the steps that are required when their visual assessment has identified unstable paint, or in the case where we have an elevated blood lead level. All the resources and links that are identified, I think, can be found here as part of that. There also were some questions about, where do I find training? And so we went through in a couple of places, and I think also on slide 49, we have some linkages to be able to then look for the EPA website for identifying firms, identifying training providers. So if you were working with your staff or owner staff that wanted to get additional training other than the visual assessment that we talked about earlier, that this would also be a resource for that. And then we talked about reaching out to others already doing lead work in your community. They may have a list of referrals, contractors that they're working with, and perhaps some feedback about who they've had good luck with, who there may have been issues with. Chris?
Somebody asked if we could expand a little bit on the sharing the information with the health department requirement. That's on slide 43.
Okay. There we go. You want to talk about
Sure.
that?
Yeah, so this is a requirement of the Lead Safe Housing Rule that if you are administering a tenant-based rental assistance program, that your program needs to share information with the health department on a quarterly basis. And we do provide two different options on how you can do this. The most common one that we see is the second option, where you're actually providing addresses of where you're funding TBRA units to the health department, and then the health department is comparing that to any children who have been identified with EBLL to the addresses that they have to see if they match any of your addresses, and then they need to communicate with you, yes we do, and then we'll start to move down the path of what do we do when we have an EBLL child. The first option listed here, where you're requesting addresses of children from the health department, I think it was a good idea when it came out, when the rule came out, but with HIPAA laws and everything now, it's probably very unlikely that the health department will provide that information to you. So we're probably more successful using the second option. But like we said yesterday, you can't just send this to the health department. There has to be some prior communication so they know when it's going to be coming. I would ask for, if I was running the program, I would have an MOU, a memorandum of understanding between me and the health department of what actions the health department was going to do when they got my data, so that I'm able to document and show in my files when HUD comes to monitor me what I'm trying to do to meet this requirement of sharing the data. Les, anything you want to add to that?
No, just when we did some earlier trainings, we were talking with people around the country in person. I think there was only one example where they actually had a really good cooperative relationship and were able to have access to a database, essentially looking at these addresses. But they were I think the only example of folks that were able to do that.
And then we also had a question come in about what's exempt from the disclosure rule. So we talked about disclosure. Where did we talk about disclosure? Like around 35, 36, 37 is when we talk about when it's exempt. But they were asking about what if it's housing exclusively for the elderly, or if they're SROs, or if it's housing exclusively for the disabled and there are no children living in those units. Then remember, if that's the case, then the Safe Housing Rule does not apply. And so we do not need to do disclosure for these exempted units.
And I think it would be important, like if you're going to say, well, I don't have to do disclosure because I have a lead-free structure, you need to have the documentation of that. So the inspection that was completed to document that would need to be in your files, so that when you're asked, well, why didn't you do disclosures, that you have that information available. Anything else, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, someone else had asked when we were, it was just a comment they made that they said, would it be more economical for an owner of a multifamily unit to conduct a full lead-based paint assessment rather than unit by unit that may be occupied by tenants with children under 6? Because remember, this is tenant-based rental assistance, so this is a voucher that's following the family. It's not necessarily tied to that property. And Bruce had let the person know that a comprehensive inspection is an option, and the closer to the construction date is to 1978, the more likely that there's little to no lead-based paint that would be found, and lead-based paint-free properties are exempt, so it would be an advantage and it could be more economical. But it's an option. The idea of using tenant-based rental assistance and being in compliance with legislative housing rule was not to provide additional burden or additional obstacles to having access to housing. So that's why the requirements are minimal for this subpart.
So I'll mention, which kind of relates a little bit when talking about owners and what they're required to do. There was a question that came in about relocation of tenants, and does the PHA, and I'm assuming this came from a PHA who's administering a program, do they have to pay for the relocation that's required while that lead hazard control work is being done? So it is the responsibility of the owner of that property. And keep in mind, this is a tenant-based rental assistance program. So if we had an owner that was not cooperative, you would essentially shift and assist that client to find another unit, and that rental assistance that's being provided would transfer to another unit. So it is the owner's responsibility. I think as the program, the key is going to be making sure that this is happening, it's happening in a timely manner, that we've got the documentation in place, and also that we have a qualified contractor that's doing the work, and then we have the required clearance testing completed. So I think even though it's the owner's responsibility, there's some hand-holding here. Now, for that temporary relocation, that household, depending on the length of time that they're being relocated, needs to be in an appropriate unit. There's a lot more flexibility under Uniform Relocation Act, which kind of governs how this operates. So if it's very short term, sometimes we're able to simply assist the household, pay for them to be in a motel, and maybe we provide some meal vouchers since they won't have cooking facilities available to them. In other cases, if it was going to be a longer term situation, we might be temporarily placing them in a rental unit, or maybe like a residence inn sort of setup where there's more cooking facilities, more resembles the unit that they are being relocated from. So it is the owner's responsibility, but there's some oversight responsibilities for the, in this case, a PHA, but it could be a home grantee, could be any number of our TBRA program operators. Chris, that's everything that I've got on my list. It looks like everything in the Q&A has been addressed.
I was just putting in some links into an answer in the Q&A. I wonder if there's anything there that we can expand upon. Somebody wanted to know if the unit inspection for TBRA can be combined with the visual assessment, and as long as that person has been trained as a visual assessor, then the answer to that is yes. They can do that, and there is no specific checklist for visual assessment, but we do have some samples of documentation in the toolkit, and so I did put the link for the visual assessment training in the answer there, as well as the link to the toolkit.
We also have a question that's come in asking about, and this is under continuum of care, the balance of state grantees. They're thinking through, how do we handle that interaction, the reporting with the health department that's required for TBRA. So, and asking, is this something that they could delegate to their subrecipients? I don't see any problem with you choosing to delegate to have the subrecipients doing that. You would need to make sure, obviously you're going to have oversight responsibilities to make sure that that's actually happening. We have always recommended that you establish a contact with the health department, and that might be one of the discussions with them about how will this best work for them. They might say, instead of having a number of subrecipients contacting them, that they would prefer to have this, in one coordinated reporting that's happening at the state level with a balance of state recipients. I think that might be a discussion to have with the health department on that.
Yeah, and somebody else in the chat asking a lot of questions about rehab. Rehab does follow Subpart J. We're not really talking about that today, but we did do training in the fall now, maybe less. We trained on Subpart J, or maybe it was the summertime. Les and I have done a lot of training this year. Happy to do that, but I've lost track of when we've done things. But there is recorded training of Subpart J, which is rehab. It was 2 weeks, two different weeks in a row, so there's 2 different sessions to listen to if you need more information about rehab, and I can try to find the link and put that in the chat. But if you go to the main landing page, you can get to any of these resources and recorded trainings off of the landing page. Unless maybe you can pull up the slide with the landing page again.
Where did I mark that? So this is the landing page, and there be as part of this, I think if we could scroll down on this, that there is a box to click on for trainings.
Yeah.
And that would give you all of the posted recordings on that, and I think also list any scheduled trainings that you might want to register for.
Yep, and I just put that in the chat, the link to get to the trainings page. I don't see any other new questions. Do you, Les?
No. Just maybe we remind folks that, depending on the types of activities that you're administering, that you may want to consider registering for the other sessions that are part of this series. So there's an upcoming session for Subpart H, which applies for project-based assistance, and then there's also a separate session on Subpart L, which applies for public housing. And each of those you would register individually for each of those. Those registrations are still open at this point.
Yeah, and
available.
And probably about half of the information, maybe 2/3 of the information, is the same as yesterday's training, because we go over the whole history, the regulations. The subparts are obviously different, and when we get into evaluation, that's going to be different. The type of treatment that's required for each subpart, that's going to be different. But a lot of the other information is the same. So if you do sign up again and you start and you're listening, you're like, wait, this is the same. The beginning is the same, and there are some other same parts. But it could be a good review for you if this is brand new. But when we do get into what's the kind of evaluation, what's the kind of treatment, what are some other things that are required specifically for H or L, that's when we'll get into it'll be different than what we talked about for tenant-based rental assistance.
I think the key is that each of these subparts then have similarly have specifics that apply to that subpart that might not be the same as in the other subparts.
Right. Yep. Well, I don't see any new questions left. You want to close this down?
I think we'll go ahead and close. I do want to mention, let me get to that slide. Oh, wait a minute. I need to go back to the slides to be able to do that. We mentioned about signing up for the mailing list, but also at the bottom here, we have the lead regulation, the contact information for future questions on that. So that might be something to keep in mind if after this then you have a question that you're not finding an answer to in the guidance materials that we have pointed to, that you also have a way to reach out to the HUD's Office of Lead Hazard Control and Healthy Homes to get further information. With that, I want to thank our folks from HUD who have been supporting us on this, and all of you for attending. We hope this has been helpful, and we'll also identify some resources that will continue to be helpful for you. Thanks, everybody, for attending.
Thanks. Bye-bye.